and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke, the 11th chapter. This is where we'll spend our time today. I was thinking this morning, I don't know if this happens to you, but think tomorrow morning when you get, I don't know what time you get up. I mean, everybody gets up at different times, but when you get up, when you go into the bathroom, right, first thing, you click on the lights, just look in the mirror and look at that which stares back at you. And think to yourself as you examine it and say to it, you are the pinnacle of God's creation. It struck me today, and I'm looking at myself in the mirror. I'd just gotten out of bed, and I'm thinking, gee whiz. So, anyway, it's good to keep in mind if you can. And for some of us, at any time of the day, I mean, we stare at it and we think, wow, is that really the pinnacle of God's creation? Yes, we are. One of the things about Jesus' teaching that really is, I think this has something to do with why people do not believe, is because Jesus takes all the wrappers off when he speaks to us. All the covers come away, all the places where we're hiding, the things about ourselves that we look at, we know they're there, but we don't think about them intentionally because we know that they're not good things about us. Jesus is so much more concerned, it seems to me. This is a window into how God looks at you and me. He is so much more concerned with that which is within than he is with that which is without. Let's take a look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 37 of chapter 11. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited Jesus to come and eat with him. So Jesus went in and reclined at the table, but the Pharisee noticed that Jesus didn't wash first before the meal and was surprised by it. Then Jesus said to the Pharisee, "Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside as well? But give what is inside the dish to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint and rue and all kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect the justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogue and the great greetings in the marketplace. Woe to you, because you are like an unmarked grave, which people walk over without even knowing it." Which for a Jew was a big deal. You didn't step over an unmarked grave. If you knew there was a grave as a Jew, you would not pass over it. You would go around it. Jesus, I want us to capture this moment. A lot of things we read in the Bible, we just read them and we think it's all about some lesson we're supposed to get. And that's true. That's true. But we don't dig in and place ourselves in this moment. Now, you all of us have had guests in our home for dinner. It's a very common thing. Just have somebody over, come over and eat a meal with us, spend some time with us. Everybody enjoys that. Stop and think for a minute here what's going on. I mean, if you invited me to your house, Rip, we want you to come over and have dinner with us. And I think, gee, free meal, I'm coming. I don't care what you're cooking, I'll eat it. So I come in, I sit down, and then when you're busy in the kitchen and you place the meal in front of me, and I just start to eat. And you think, that's odd. I mean, nobody else is at the table. What's he doing eating without the rest of us to sit down? And then you sit down, and before you can get one or two forks in your mouth, I call you wicked. You foolish person. You clean the outside. I mean, just stop and look at what Jesus is doing here. He's invited over to dinner, and he's just hammering this poor Pharisee. It's hard to imagine what this must have been like to be in this moment, especially if you're the Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees were not evil people, but this was shocking what was happening to them. Here's how it works. If you're a really obedient Jew and it comes time for you to eat, especially if you're a Pharisee, because they were so scrupulous in their obedience to the law. That was their whole life, was to be scrupulous about obeying the law. And because they were supported by temple taxes, they could do it. Average person, no way. If you were a shepherd, a carpenter, a tanner, a whatever, there was no way in this world you could obey the law in this way. Here's what would happen. All right, it's dinner time. You go over to the laver of water that you have in your home, and you take a little vessel of that water, and you start way up here on your arm. And this is all written, this is all known. I mean, this is all part of the law. And you start washing your way down to your hands. And you have certain ways that you have to rub your hands and your fingers together with the water. And then you take the other arm and you do the same thing. Then when you get done with all that, then you take the water and you pour it over your hands, starting in a certain spot and ending in another, and you do all this. Now, Jesus is probably half done with his meal by the time all this goes on with this Pharisee. And he is just absolutely washing himself in the ceremonial way while Jesus is over there chowing down. So the Pharisee comes back to the table. Jesus, a rabbi, has done none of this, and the Pharisee's just shocked. I mean, what would you think if I came to your house? Better yet, I invite you to my house. Okay, so I open the door and I say, "Oh, it's you." And you just come in. I just go and sit down, and I don't say, "Would you like something to drink?" Or I don't say anything about, "Would you like to sit down and have an appetizer?" I don't say anything. I just go sit down at the table and start eating. And pretty soon you're wondering what's going on here. I mean, what's the matter with all of this? The fact that Jesus didn't participate is absolutely like that for this Pharisee. He is just shocked at what Jesus is doing because Jesus is a rabbi. He should know. Now, the Pharisees, this is something where the Bible, in my view, in the New Testament, distorts the picture of the Pharisees that we really should have. They were not evil people. They were not evil people. The Pharisees were people who cared deeply about the nation of Israel. I would encourage everybody in this room, if you want to understand why the Pharisees cared so much, go home today when you get ready and read Deuteronomy chapter 28. Just read the whole thing. First 15 verses sound great. If you'll obey God, then all these nice things happen for 15 verses. But verse 16, if you disobey God, for about 18 more verses, things get really bad. Because God is going to do things to you to help you remember, help me remember how it is we should obey God's law. The Pharisees at this time in history are looking at Jesus and they're looking at the nation. And the reason that they are so careful to obey the law is they've read that too. They don't want that stuff to happen to the nation. All these terrible things that God's going to do if we're disobedient to the law. So you can imagine Jesus is shocking to them in this moment. He's shocking to them in the stuff that he does. He's shocking to them in the stuff that he says. There were about 6,000 Pharisees in the nation at the time of this writing. And there are 7 different kinds of them. And each one of them has particulars about the way in which they obey the law. The Shechemite Pharisees obeyed the law for profit. Go back and read about Shechem and you'll understand how that all works. The tumbling Pharisees walked around bent way over like this all the time. They wanted to look humble. They looked like they were falling downhill all the time, so they were called the tumbling Pharisee. Then you had the bleeding Pharisee. These guys were so dedicated to not seeing anything sinful that they walked around outdoors with their eyes shut. Now you can imagine how you would wind up being called a bleeding Pharisee walking around like that, right? How many things do you crash into and how many things do you fall over and wind up on the ground with cuts and scratches? Pretty soon you look pretty rough. They were the bleeding Pharisee. The mortar Pharisee wore this fez. Everybody knows what a fez is. You've seen the history of like the Ottoman Empire, that little flat cone shape looks like a giant, one of those red party cups, but it's real big and it fits over your head. They had one especially made that came down to about here. They could look under the bottom of it and see where they were going, but they wouldn't see anything sinful like a woman. So they were called the mortar Pharisee. Then you had the one who were called the what am I supposed to do now Pharisee. They were usually young in their Pharisaical practice. And so they would go to the other Pharisees and say, I want to obey the law today. What do you think I ought to do? Then you had the Pharisee from fear. They were the ones that were just scared to death that if they messed up, God was going to curse them and the rest of the nation as well. And then you had a Pharisee that was the Pharisee from love. They actually loved God and wanted to obey Him out of that. Jesus was hard on them for specific reasons. And it didn't have to do with the fact that they were just bad people. He was hard on them because they had what was known. You had the 613 precepts of Moses. Those everybody knew because they were written down. Then you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of laws that were the oral law. And the oral law nobody knew. Everybody just kind of guessed at it. The Pharisees knew it because that was their whole life, was knowing the law and obeying it. So they heaped those laws on other people. This is where it becomes really different from the way that Jesus would have us think about God. And I'll tell you how that is. Take any pagan religion on earth. Any pagan religion. Take the time of Jesus, you had the Romans and Greeks. They had the pagan pantheon, Zeus and the rest of the mob. What was your goal as a pagan? It was very different from what God, the real one, would have us have as a goal in relationship to Him. If you were a pagan, what you wanted was that the gods didn't pay any attention to you at all. You wanted them off your back. That's why you did all these things, to make them happy. You see these villagers in these movies run up to the top. Everybody's got on the big headdress with bananas and fruit and everything, bones through their nose, and they go up to the top of the volcano and they dump a bunch of vegetables or a pig or maybe a person into the volcano so that the volcano god doesn't torch the village that year. That's what a pagan does. You do everything you possibly can to make these deities happy. Why do you think at the time of Solomon and prior, people were sacrificing living children into a fire? Throwing living children into the fire to worship Molech. Why do you think that was? We don't want Molech to look at us. Let's do whatever it takes to keep Molech off our back. That's paganism. The Pharisees, without knowing it, were living as pagans. We're going to do all we can to make God happy so that He won't do bad things to us. That's what they were doing, and they were visiting that on the people. So that the people, the Pharisees didn't like the people. They called them the people of the land. We would say the people of the dirt. They said that because those people, you and me, could not keep the law like they could. Can you imagine a shepherd out in the field with a flock? You take your flocks miles from your home and you graze them on the hillsides where there's actually something for them to eat. You're out there for weeks. Where are you going to do this hand washing thing? You don't have a laver, you don't have water like that. There's no way that you can behave in such a way and live your life and obey the law. But if you're looking at the law as a pagan does, wow, what a burden to have to carry around. That's the distinction. That's what angered Jesus. Can you imagine being Jesus for just a minute? You're the maker of the universe in the flesh. You know everything that's going on. There's a passage wherein Jesus encounters a leper. And the texts, the manuscripts that we have vary. One of them says Jesus looked on the leper with compassion. Another says He looked on the leper with anger. I like the second one. He's not mad at the leper. He's mad at leprosy. He's angry as the maker of the universe. He's looking at His creation suffering with something that's there that He never intended to be. Now this is very similar to what's going on here. Jesus is looking at the people of the land, you and me, and saying these Pharisees are putting burdens on them like a pagan that they have to then try to strain to live under, and they can't do it. You can't be a tanner, a carpenter, a shop owner, a seamstress, or a seamster, or anything, and keep the law the way the Pharisees had designed it to be. For them, the smallest detail of the law that wasn't attended to was sin. And it was sin that was punishable. See, this is why he was so angry. They were doing it to the people he loved. And he loved the Pharisees too. He's angry with them because they're doing it to themselves. It's not that God wants to give us a whole different set of laws that we've got to obey like the pagans. Why do you think Jesus said to us when he taught us how to pray, don't involve yourself with this endless repetition like the pagans do? God knows what you want before you ever ask. That's so freeing, isn't it? Jesus is he's looking at you and me and saying, I want you to live. What do you think that passage means when he says, I came to give them life and life more abundant? It's not he's trying to bring us extra burdens to carry around. He's trying to set us free to be who we were made to be. And we forget that. And there's another aspect of this that we forget, that this text, in my mind, shows us. We go about our lives many times, I think, in a sense of being kind of, disguised from God. We think that we've got to put on something that God is going to like better than who he made us to be. And we think if we'll put that on and show up and say right things and say them the right way, that God's going to be so impressed that he's going to give us what we're asking for. Very much like the pagans who run up to the rim of the volcano with the pig or the fruit or the person and throw them in so that the volcano god won't torch the village that year. That's how we relate to him a lot. We're coming at it the same way the Pharisees came at it. And Jesus is angered by that. He wants you and me to come to him as who he is, the Maker who loves us, who wants for us to be free from all those burdens. He doesn't want us to carry any of those. But we forget that God really knows. Putting on a disguise in front of God accomplishes absolutely nothing. Saying fancy words, praying a certain way, obeying a certain order of things does not impress God. Just set that aside. What impresses God is what's in here. This is what he's impressed with. Who are we inside? How are we living before him in here, not outside? That's why Jesus said to the Pharisee, you're so careful to tithe all the little herbs. You know what they would do? If they were going to put mint on their meal, they would carefully, can you imagine? You know how mint, when you grind it up, it's just a little tiny, like pepper. Take tiny little bits of it and scrape that bit aside, 10%. Make sure that goes to God, and then scrape the rest onto your food. And do that with everything you put on your food, every piece of food. Every bit of the grain you took into your house, everything you had, you're scraping 10% of it away. And Jesus says, that's great, but you forgot about the love of God and mercy. The weightier matters, the things that really matter to you and to me. How we treat ourselves and how we treat others. Those are the things that matter. That's why Jesus was so hard. He's not hard on this Pharisee because he hates him. He's hard on this Pharisee because he loves him. And he sees what kind of prison this Pharisee is in, and what kind of prison the Pharisaical system was putting people in as well. We do that ourselves. We put ourselves in prisons and we bring others along. What's inside is what matters. There was this little boy on the beach, and he's wanting to swim. He's 12 years old. He's old enough to swim in the ocean without supervision. And so he's out there and he's looking around, and he gets ready to go, and he sticks his hands in his pockets and he finds 3 quarters. Oh no. What am I going to do? If I get in the water with the quarters, I'll lose my quarters. And you know, for a 12-year-old boy, 3 quarters is a lot. He looks over there and he sees this woman laying on a towel sunbathing. So he goes over there to her and he says to her, ma'am, she says, yes. do you go to church? The woman says, well, yeah, I go to church. He says, do you believe in God? She says, yeah, that's why I go to church, because I believe in God. He says, do you read your Bible and pray and stuff like that? She says, yeah, I read my Bible, I pray and stuff like that. He says, here, would you hold these 3 quarters for me while I go in the ocean? He was looking at her, and there was nothing he could see that would tell him she was trustworthy to hold on to those quarters. It's kind of like that old quip, you know, if you break down in the middle of Atlanta, in the bad part of Atlanta, I don't know what part's good, but let's say you break into the really bad part of Atlanta, you break down in your car, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you see 5 big guys coming toward you. Would it matter to you that they were just coming out of a Bible study? It would matter to me if I knew that. I'd feel a whole bunch better, wouldn't you? Or if they just came out from beating somebody up. It would matter. It matters what's on the inside. It mattered to that little boy. There was a bunch of guys once, I read of these guys who were gathered, they had this game they played called Let's Tell a Lie. And whoever could tell the biggest one was the one who won. That's how you win the contest, these little guys. And so they were on this street corner gathered up telling lies. And there was a dog in front of them. And this pastor, why it was a pastor, it's one of those stories you think, well, it's got to be a pastor, right? Somebody who's going to cause some difficulty. That's what pastors do. They make difficulty where there is none before. And so the pastor walks up to these little guys and he says, what are you guys doing? He says, well, we're telling lies. He said, well, what are you doing that for? Well, whoever can tell the biggest and best one gets the dog. And the pastor says, you know, when I was your age, I never thought to tell a lie. And one of the little boys bends over and picks up and hands him the dog and says, I guess you win. What's on the inside is what matters. That's what God sees. He's not looking at what we say and do on the outside. He's looking at what's on the inside. We were at a funeral a couple weeks ago, and I don't use this as an example necessarily, but you could take this to be any funeral. There was a woman and her little boy at a funeral. And the pastor just went on and on and on and on about how great this guy was in the coffin. And the woman leans over to the little boy and says, you know, when he gets done, go up there and make sure that's your dad in there. All right? I mean, we forget that what's on the inside is what matters. We think it's all about what we look like to other people. And I'm telling you, we just need to remember God doesn't care about that. He cares about what's in here. And God can make it clean. That's what Jesus was referring to. You know, it says in the text, not all the manuscripts, the Greek manuscript does not have give it to the poor. Does not have that. It just says give it. What does it mean? It means I bring ourselves to God and hand them to Him. And He'll make the inside of the dish as clean as the outside. You and I can't do that. We can't do anything but surrender to Him. I like that. To me, that's great. If it's up to me, I'm just going to work myself into a foam trying to be somebody that I'm just not. I was walking this morning and praying and thinking to myself about, I'll just tell you what happened. When my grandparents, 2 of the most godly people I ever knew, died, I was living in Pennsylvania. They were here. And I could not come to their funerals. I think about that and I think, God, please forgive me that I wasn't there for their funerals. We have a dog. We have 2 dogs now. And when we got the first one, she's a fairly large dog. She's a 60-pound dog, which to me is a pretty big dog. And when she was a puppy, I'll never forget this. This stuck with me, and it reminded me of this text, reminded me of this, about what's on the inside and what God wants for you and for me. This dog It has a habit, still to this day, it lays down right in the walkway of a doorway. And it's big. No, it's not a Chihuahua. It's hard. I have to hold onto the door jambs so that I can carefully get over this dog. I don't want to hurt the dog. And I'll never forget when we first got the dog, Jackson, he was only 11, 12 years old. And kids are careless. You know, they're kids, right? And he was walking past the dog and he stepped down right in front of her nose. And Becky saw it and said, I want you to be careful walking around that dog. Look at that dog. And we all turned to look at the dog. Look at how peacefully that dog is sleeping there, trusting that you're not going to hurt it in any way. And I thought, what a picture of what we're supposed to be before God. Trusting that God is not going to hurt us in any way. That's what he's looking for. That's why Jesus was so angry with the Pharisees that day. It took that picture away from the people and from the Pharisee and gave them a picture of a God who maybe does want to hurt us if we don't straighten up. That is not the perception that God has of you and me. He wants to see what's on the inside clean, and he's the only one who can make it clean. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I